And it's a little after 6, so we will be starting our workshop. I want to introduce Tom Hennick. He's here to do a FOIA workshop. I've attended his workshops before. They're very informative. Tom's a very open, easy person, so if you have any questions or anything, I'm sure at one point.
No, as we go on, actually, that's one of
Okay.
the things that, if I say something that doesn't resonate, you want to ask the question, ask it right on the spot. So
Okay.
Sometimes that leads to an even better discussion than we might have had otherwise.
So I hand the floor over to Tom.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom, for coming out.
Thanks for having me. I was just telling them that, I like to experience it. When I come out at night, I just had a nice dinner at Gus's. Very nice, good stuff. So even if the rest of the night doesn't go all that well, then we're off to a good start, right? Thank you for inviting us. We really enjoy doing these workshops when people ask us to come, because it means you're interested in finding out a little bit about freedom of information, about doing the right thing, about making sure that you conduct your business in an open, transparent fashion. So the idea tonight is not to beat you up, make you miserable. It's to talk to you. It's to give you some basics. It's to answer any questions you might have. Remember, no question is stupid. This law can be really confusing sometimes. And to try to make it so that when you walk out of here, your comfort level with FOI is higher than it is before we start. I'm not an attorney, so this is not like binding legal advice or anything like that. It's advice based on experiences. On January 2nd, it will be 18 years at the FOI Commission, which I can hardly believe. But I've seen a lot. I go out and do these workshops. I spend a lot of time answering questions on the phone. And so again, you now have a face to put with the voice. Some of you have taken advantage of that, I think. But you can always call with a question. We're happy to try to answer it. If I don't know, I'm never afraid to say I don't know. I'll get you an answer, and you can say, okay, swell, that's what he thinks, we're going to do something else. But at least you have an idea what the FOI Commission thinks you might do in certain circumstances. In the interest of full disclosure, before I joined FOI, I was a journalist. Now, I don't know, is that good news or bad news? How do you feel about that?
Good. Sometimes good.
Sometimes bad, right? The reason I share that is that I've kind of seen FOI from a different angle than some of my colleagues who are trained as attorneys. A lot of times when I'm answering those questions on the phone, I can anticipate what's coming, because I was the one maybe pushing a public official a long time ago to sort of ask the question that I'm about to answer. The other thing I'll tell you, let me just see a show of hands. How many of you are members of boards and commissions? Good number of you. So when you go to Gus's, you get a big hug, right? Thanks for all the work you do, and free food and drinks, right? A lot of times when I do these sessions at night, people say, Tom, you don't get it. We're volunteers. We have a real life. We do something else during the day, and then it's almost sometimes like a second full-time job, you know? And, well, I get that too. For 10 years, I was a member of a board in my town. I was the chairman for the last 5. And a year ago, and I'm not quite sure why, they said, would you serve out this person's term and you come back and do it on another board of selectmen in my town? I said yes. I'm not quite sure why I said yes, but so I get it. I get what it's like. You know, I've had to reschedule some things. Once I got that meeting scheduled, it's another job. But just being a volunteer doesn't excuse us from having to follow freedom of information. It's the law in the state of Connecticut, and it goes hand in hand with being on boards and commissions, with being a public servant. And it's about being transparent and open and making sure that the people can see what's going on so that democracy can work. I know that sounds a little sort of highbrow, but that's really what it's about. It's about making sure the government is not operating in secret, so that when it comes time to vote at a referendum or it comes time to vote at a general election, people have facts to work with so that they know what's going on. As I said, the law is 43 years old. It was Ella Grasso's brainchild when she ran for governor for the first time. And if you do the math, 43 years ago puts us right smack in the middle of Watergate. So you've got a country that was in turmoil, on the verge of a constitutional crisis. Primarily, people felt because government was being conducted secretly, behind closed doors, people didn't know what was going on. So when she was contemplating this run for governor back in 1974, she was also in Congress. So this was all exploding all around her, and she was really kind of upset by it and said, if I run for governor, one of the first things we're going to make sure we do is has put together some sort of an open government law. So as you know, she ran in 1974 and she won, and that literally is one of the first things she did in 1975. She pushed the concept of this open government law, and then she did something that's kind of interesting. She said, you know, this is really important to our state. It's so important that I will see to it that it is approved unanimously by our legislature. Have you ever watched the legislature? Can you imagine guaranteeing a unanimous vote on that law or on anything? She did, and she got it. I am here to testify that I've seen a video of the vote in the House and the Senate. There was not a single no vote, which proves to all of us how relevant it was then, and how important it was, and how important and relevant it is still today. But other than being interesting, I bring it up when I do these workshops, because think about getting a unanimous vote on anything. Those of you who are on boards, think about getting a unanimous vote on anything with even the slightest bit of controversy in it. It's hard. You got to negotiate. You got to go back and forth. Well, I like this and I don't like that. If we take this out and we put this in, there had to be a lot of back and forth and a lot of arm twisting. So you've got a law that's based on a really simple, easy concept: open government. Do things in public. But when you read it, has anybody tried to read it? Has anybody looked at it? Tried to dig into it? It's okay if you haven't, because once you do, your intuition will take you this way, and the law might take you that way, and your eyes start rolling to the back of your head, and you think, oh my God, the wherefores and the whereases and stuff like that. Because what they did when they put this law together was base it on that simple, easy concept, but then they left a lot open to interpretation. So that those of you, all of us who are on the front line, sometimes have to make a decision. Gee, should we be in executive session? Gee, is this a record we want to withhold? Is this a record we want to give out? And you've got to make those decisions sometimes on the fly. And to do that, you've got to be able to know a little bit about the law, which brings us back to why we're here tonight, to give you the tools to work with, so when it comes time to make that kind of a call, you're best equipped to handle it, so that you don't wind up at Hartford at an FOIA hearing. Now, one of the things this law did, in addition to guaranteeing people right to open government, right to access, was create the Freedom of Information Commission, which is where I work. And that commission was established to give people an opportunity, if there is a problem, if someone believes they've been denied access to what this law guarantees, they come to the FOI Commission and they file a complaint. And if they file a complaint, they're saying that you as a public agency haven't guaranteed that, haven't given them that access, and they ask the FOI Commission basically to referee, to adjudicate, to make sure that the law is followed. And you don't want to have to do that. You have other jobs to do, you have boards and commissions to run, you have a town to run, someone from the Board of Education is here, you have school systems to run. And so the idea is to understand FOI and understand why it's important, but not to get hung up on it so that you have a problem with it. Now, we call it freedom of information. One of the first things I always tell people is it's not really about free information. It's about access. It's about access to two basic things: to public meetings and to public records. And what I'm going to do is talk about both prongs of that. And as we go along, as I said, ask questions. But before we go into that, we should talk about the fact that it's called freedom of information. It's probably not the best name for it, because a lot of people think it's something that it's not. They think it's about free information. I don't know if any of you have had this happen, but the people will march into offices or police departments or things like that and say, freedom of information, tell me what happened last night. Freedom of information, how did they arrive at that budget figure? Freedom of information, there was a cruiser in my neighborhood last night. What happened? Well, we're all public servants, right? We're going to answer questions, but that's not what this law does. So if that ever happens to you, or you're in a position to think, oh, freedom of information will give me that answer, remember, it's not about people answering questions. It's about access to records that might have the information in it, and to meetings where the issues are going to be discussed. And a lot of times people say, Tom, you probably ought to stop doing the FOI workshops. What you really ought to do is put together an hour of stand-up and tell people what happens at the Freedom of Information Office. Because people see freedom of information, and they think that we are the information center for the entire state of Connecticut. They call us with all kinds of questions and and emails that come in. You would probably be shocked at some of the stuff we get. I had a woman call a couple of years ago, hysterically asking me how she could get tickets to see a show at the Bushnell. I need to know, tell me free information, how do I get the tickets? And I have to explain to her that that's not part of our job, that's not what we do. I did give her the box office number. I looked it up and gave it to her, so I hope she got to the show, but it's not that. Let me read this one email to you. I'll read you a couple, but just to show you that it's not about free. They think that we're in this vault, this huge vault, with every record held by every agency in the state of Connecticut, and they write to us and say, send me this and send me that. And I have to explain to them that that's not what the law is about. That's not what we're here for. Dear sir, please provide an electronic copy via email, preferably a spreadsheet, showing all the Medicaid-paid electroconvulsive treatments, aka ECT, aka shock treatment. My request includes every field you have available, but certainly not patient identifiers. This request includes but is not limited to the name of the psychiatrist, license number, date of treatment, age of patient, city, county, name of treatment facility, address of facility, cost of treatment, etc. Time frame, as far back as your computer records exist. Best regards, Ken Kramer, psychsearch.net. Will somebody tell me what I'm supposed to do with that, please? So we get a lot of a similar fashion. So I have this sort of standard thing, a couple of sentences where you say, Connecticut Freedom of Information Commission, not a repository for records. We don't have the records. You got to go to the agency that has them. Then if they tell you no, then you come see it. Okay. Most people are grateful. Ken wasn't quite so grateful. His response to me is, well then, be a good public servant and get it into the correct hands, instead of just blowing it off. Best regards, Ken Kramer, psychsearch.net. I'll share, I got a million of them. I'll share one other one with you. This comes this summer, right? Hi, the 1108 Whitney Avenue has a big board in the middle of the pavement. Makes a concern about possible risk of injury for both traffic or pedestrian. Please help to remove the board immediately because of heavy traffic, we cannot move. Thanks. So evidently, our responsibility is to put me in my car and drive down to New Haven or New Hampton, wherever that is on Whitney Avenue, and move a board. The reason for sharing a couple of these is it's not what people think it is sometimes. So that may be, with your constituents, with even people on your boards, you have to explain to them that it's not about that. Access to meetings and access to records. When we talk about meetings, let me read the definition. I don't read a lot of definitions, but listen to the words. Meeting means any hearing or other proceeding of a public agency, any convening or assembling of a quorum of a multi-member public agency, and any communication prior to a quorum of a multi-member public agency, whether in person or by means of electronic equipment, to discuss or act upon a matter over which the public agency has supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory power. Board members, anytime you gather to do your work, consider it a meeting. And make sure you've done some basic things. Make sure it's noticed, make sure it's open to the public, and make sure there are minutes when the meeting is done. All too often, people who do what you do and what I do get hung up on words. Well, it's just a workshop. It's just an informal gathering. We went to Gus's for dinner. If you are doing your work, the work that you are assigned as a board or a committee or a commission, it is a meeting. And you need to make sure that that agenda is available, that it's open, and that there are minutes. We're going to form a little subcommittee. We have a 10-member board. We're going to form a 3-member subcommittee. That's not the whole board. They don't need to worry about FOI, do they? Well, anytime I hear they don't need to worry about it, I get nervous because that means people are trying to find a way around it. Well, the answer is yes, they do. Because the definition of a public agency, which is what this law applies to, has a phrase in it that says including any committee of or created by. So if your 10-member board forms a 3-member subcommittee, that subcommittee becomes a separate entity in the eyes of this law and needs to follow the same rules. A lot of times I'll get this, well, it wasn't a subcommittee, but we didn't have a quorum, so we're not going to worry about FOI. That's not true either. There is an appellate court ruling in Connecticut that says if you don't have a quorum, it's not a meeting under FOI. There's also an appellate court ruling in Connecticut that says if you don't have a quorum, you are still having a meeting under FOI. I want that to sink in for a second. The appellate court in the state of Connecticut has told us the exact opposite thing, which means, well, what do we answer when people ask, right? Because that no quorum, still a meeting exists, there are situations where even absent a quorum, it could be a meeting. So the idea that, well, if only 3 of us meet, it's not a meeting because it's not a quorum, may not be the case. The most recent development that comes to us out of Meriden, on the other side of the state. And Meriden was having what they called an executive meeting of leaders of their council. And they were in a room, and the reporter from the Meriden paper walked into the town hall. Now, just as a by the way, don't do what they did. What are you doing here, reporter? Well, this looks like a meeting. It's not a meeting, get out. Probably should have thought about the fact that his or her antenna were gonna go up and say, well, why don't they want me here? So, the reporter filed a complaint and said, look, that looked like pretty important members of a council, and they were doing something important. In fact, they were doing something important. They were selecting people to serve on a search committee for a new town manager. Their contention was it was not a quorum, therefore it's not a meeting. The reporter filed a complaint. The FOI commission ruled that under those circumstances, that non-quorum gathering was indeed a meeting. They were doing something important. Now, when someone doesn't like a decision that the FOI commission makes, you can appeal it. You can take it all the way to the state Supreme Court. Meriden has appealed that decision. It went to the Superior Court, and the court upheld the FOI commission. So that's the last ruling as of January. Now, they are going to appeal it again to the appellate court, I'm told. Maybe we'll finally get a yes or no answer. You know, you would think, just as a by the way, okay, the appellate court makes two different rulings. Where would you go to break the tie? The Supreme Court, right? So the matter actually did go to the Supreme Court, and the court took oral arguments. It heard from both sides. And then it said, we have improvidently taken this matter up, you guys figure it out. Let both rulings stand. So that's kind of why we're in that pickle right now. So even absent a quorum, it could be a meeting. The law talks to us about three kinds of meetings. It talks to us about a regular meeting, a special meeting, and an emergency meeting. The regular meeting is the meeting that you have per a schedule that you submit to town hall by the end of January of every year. We meet on the first and third Tuesday, the second and fourth Wednesday. That becomes your regular meeting slot. There's a time, there's a place. People see special meeting and they say, we can't do this, we can. Special meeting, folks, is the same as a regular meeting with one exception. Well, two exceptions. It's not at your regular place and time. Stuff happens, people can't come, holiday season, snowstorms. You have to cancel the meeting and reschedule it. That makes it a special meeting. You can do anything you want to do at a special meeting. Here's the difference. For both of them, that agenda that I talked about has to be available at least 24 hours in advance. Any agenda preparers in the room? Anybody who has to do agendas? Make sure you're as specific as possible when you put those together. But that's especially so for the special meeting, because at a regular meeting, should something arise that's not on that agenda, the board will vote to add it to the agenda by a two-thirds measure, two-thirds of those who are present. At a special meeting, you can't add anything. So if we use the template that says other business, old business, new business, that's not really the best thing to have on an agenda, but at least at a regular meeting, the chairman can say, is there any other business? Yes, Madam Chairman, I'd like to add, and make a motion, and two-thirds say to add it, you can do it. But at a special meeting, you can't. So a special meeting, an item that says other business or old business with nothing listed underneath, you might as well take it off because it's pointless. You can't say, is there any other business? That's the fundamental difference between the two. And you can do, absolutely anything. Either some people are afraid that minutes of special meetings, or that you can do anything you want. You just can't add anything to the agenda, that's all. The third kind of meeting, the emergency meeting, folks, is a meeting that I really discourage boards and commissions from using. Emergency meeting is an unnoticed meeting. The reason I discourage its use is that it's an unnoticed meeting, and what you and I think might be an emergency doesn't necessarily rise to that level in the eyes of the law. Intuitively, it feels like an emergency to us lay people, if you will, but the law sets the bar really high because it doesn't want our boards and commissions to meet in an unnoticed fashion. Last month we had Veterans Day. A lot of towns were closed, town halls were closed on Monday for Veterans Day. That Tuesday morning, as happens after every one of those holidays, I took a call very early in the morning. Someone says, Tom, I've got a problem. I said, what's the problem? They said, our regular meeting is tonight, Tuesday night. And I said, okay, what's the problem? Well, Monday, we always put the agendas in at least 24 hours in advance. We forgot town hall was closed yesterday. So I put it in this morning. Is that okay? Well, no, that's not 24 hours. That's not okay. Well, then we've got too much to do. I'm going to call it an emergency and we'll go ahead and meet. Guys, oops, I forgot. It's not an emergency. in our minds, if we take this law away, yeah, we gotta go because we got a lot to do, budgets are coming, you know, all that sort of stuff. But my suggestion under those circumstances is always to wait 24 hours and notice it as a special meeting and move forward that way. You don't want to run into a problem. So people say, well, what could happen? What's the big deal? Our commission has a couple of stronger powers other than saying, Plainfield, that was a mistake, don't do it again. It can issue civil penalties against the individuals who commit the violation of anywhere from $20 to $1,000. But from a board and commission standpoint, the one that scares me the most is that it can declare null and void something that happens at an improper meeting. Quick story. A few years ago over in Ridgefield on the other side of the state, the situation where the assistant fire chief thought he was about to become the next chief. He was very excited about this possibility until he found out that the rumor was false. And he went into the first selectman's office, beware, and started screaming and yelling, and they had, oh, I'm told it was a beauty, screaming, yelling, cursing, oh, it was awful. The guy leaves. The first selectman calms him down, I should say, and says, look, you can be the interim chief while we look, but you're not going to be the next chief. We're going in a different direction. So he leaves. He's really angry. And it doesn't take very long, because Ridgefield, like Plainfield, like most of our towns are small. The phone starts ringing off the hook. I heard what happened. This is terrible. The bottom line is the first selectman is led to believe that this is a problem in that he was being threatened, and that this fight, this guy's bellicose nature was, you know, really off. First of all, it was insubordinate, but he was threatening him. It was a danger to him. You got to do something. So the first selectman thinks about it and says, well, maybe so. This happened on a Friday, so he's going to have an emergency meeting of his board the next morning, Saturday morning. They have the meeting and they talk about it, and they decide, you know what, we don't need this guy, he's out of here, he's fired. Well, they can't find him. It's a Saturday morning. So they send people out all over town, they find him, they drag him down to town hall, and they say, thanks for coming in, you're fired. He gets mad all over again. You blanky blanks can't fire me because I quit. So they reconvene the emergency meeting and accept his resignation. Not the end of the story. He, the fire guy, says, you know what was the emergency? I know a little bit about this FOI stuff. What was the emergency? There was no emergency there. They should have noticed that meeting. So he files a complaint with the FOI commission. And the commission hears facts from both sides and says, you know what? There was no emergency there. In fact, they were probably trying to do it so he wouldn't know what was going on. We find a violation and we declare null and void what happened at that meeting. Still no real problem, except they don't like that decision. So they appeal it all the way to the state Supreme Court. Now, if you've ever been involved in something like that, it doesn't happen overnight. So about 5.5 to 6 years later, the Supreme Court issues a ruling and says, we also declare null and void. Now, we don't always win, as it were. Our decisions can get interpreted differently too. That's one of the things that makes this hard. But in this case, the court agreed with us and said, we also declare null and void what happened at that meeting. So I can see some people understanding immediately. 5.5 to 6 years later, the guy was off the payroll and he was supposed to be on it. What kind of back pay do they want, right? There were conversations about some medical issues that he might have had. And if he, as a retiree, he had this plan, but he would have had this plan if he was still, and there was a mess. Think of the legal fees. Think of the legal fees. Think of the acrimony, the agita in town, all because they didn't wait 24 hours. This is an extreme example of what can happen. I mean, I don't want you to get scared, but think, let's do the right thing, because once that snowball starts rolling down the hill, you can have a real problem on your hands. A question that gets asked a lot is, why didn't they just notice a meeting and do it right? You know, even if you want to go through the process of having the commission rule against you, that's what I would have recommended had they called. Redo it. Even if you don't think you did it wrong, redo it, and then what's the remedy? We could declare it null and void, but if you've already fixed it, the problem's gone away. So, boards and commissions, again, I recognize, we all recognize, we're volunteers, and sometimes this stuff happens. We try to do the right thing, but sometimes it happens. You can try to fix it before it becomes a major problem. Sometimes we are stubborn, as I believe Ridgefield was in that situation. They probably wish they weren't. They hadn't been. If you ever have an emergency, if you ever have a situation you say, this is a real emergency, we've got to act now, we cannot wait 24 hours. You have the meeting, you discuss only that emergency topic, and within 72 hours create minutes that reflect what the emergency was, who was there, and what you did about it. What's an example? People say, give me an example of an emergency. It's not defined all that clearly. But the best example I have came about 5 or 6 years ago. We had a winter that seemed like we got 5 feet of snow every 20 minutes. Remember that one? And what happened was people with schools and municipal buildings looked up on the roof and said, uh-oh. And a couple of them had to act that morning to hire professionals to get up there and remove the mounds of snow so that the roofs didn't come in. That's kind of an emergency. So they met in the morning, they moved money, they allocated money, they authorized whatever they had to do, and by noon, somebody was up there getting the snow off so that they didn't lose the building. That's the kind of emergency that required that kind of action. Remember that your meetings are open to the public. Anybody can come. Hey, what are you doing here? You don't live here, that kind of thing. You're from Putnam. Putnam, what are you doing here? It doesn't matter. Anybody can come and can come to a meeting. Anybody can audio or videotape a meeting. If people walk in with cameras, you can't throw them out. I have a housing authority in Trumbull that's a little camera shy. Can we ask them to turn it off at certain points in the meeting? No. It's a public meeting and anybody can record it. Now, I often give this advice to board members. We're all kind of recording types today, aren't we? Do I have my prop? No, I left. But we all have our phones, right? And people record. I recommend to people at board meetings to just assume that somebody's recording it, Just think, one of the things I don't like about this provision is it doesn't require anybody to tell you that they're recording. A camera like that is obvious, but people take their phones and put them on in front, on their laps or things like that. I don't like it. I wish that were a little different, but the bottom line is anybody can do it. This law does not guarantee anybody the right to speak at a public meeting. Many people believe that it does. Maybe people believe that it's a guaranteed right under FOIA, and it's not. So who speaks, when they speak, if they speak at all, entirely in the hands of the board. Do most of your boards have a public comment or a public speaking, public participation thing on their agenda? That's fine. Many do. If you took it off, you'd probably have a political uprising of some kind. But if you don't want it on a given night, the law, the FOI law, doesn't require it. And on some nights, you might want to limit it. You might have a room full of people and you say, if we don't limit this, we're going to be here all night, probably into the early hours of tomorrow. So we're going to limit it to every comment to 3 minutes. And we're going to keep track, and we're not being rude, but when 3 minutes are up, you're going to sit down and the next person's going to speak because we want to hear from everybody. Everybody should have the same rights. If you're going to do anything like that, my advice there, again, this is not in the law, is to be consistent. So if I like you and I give you 5 minutes, and I don't like her and I give her 3, you don't want to do that. Give everybody 3 and you're fine. And there's no problem with that as far as the FOI Act is concerned. Public speaking is in the hands of the board. One little thing people ask, they say, well, wait, I read in the FOI Act that you don't have to tell anybody that you're going to a meeting. Like there shouldn't be a sign-in sheet to require admission to a meeting. That's true. But then how come they make me sign up to speak? Well, because speaking is not covered by FOI. You can handle that any way you want, so you can ask people to sign up to speak and identify themselves. You just can't make that a prerequisite to entering the meeting to observe. Okay. Sure, boards and commissions operate in the public. There are a couple avenues that boards and commissions can use to exclude the public. And we all heard the term executive session. Okay? Remember that an executive session is a portion of a publicly noticed open meeting. It's not something that sits on an island by itself. So let's suppose you've got an evening and the only thing on the agenda is something that's appropriate for executive session. You still need to have a notice. You still need to open in public. And you need to vote to go into that executive session by a 2/3 vote of those board members who are present. A lot of people think, well, no, it's an executive session, we're not going to notice it. No, it's still, so you open it, you vote to go into executive session, 2/3 say yes, you go in, you have your discussion, and come out to take whatever action you're going to take. Do not ever vote behind closed doors. It's really important that every vote be recorded in the minutes, and it's clear in those minutes who voted for what or for whom. So come out, take your action, and then you adjourn and go home. Don't even think about well, can I see a show of hands before we go vote? That inevitably leads to a problem. Somebody feels he doesn't, no consensus, no show of hands. Are we done here? Yes, and you come out. There are 5 specific reasons for an executive session. There's a personnel matter, pending claims and pending litigation, a security matter, a property transaction. The town is going to lease a new building for the police station, and it's negotiating with different land building owners around town. You can have those negotiations behind closed doors. You wouldn't have to negotiate in public, fear being that negotiating in public might negatively impact the town's position. So you can do that behind closed doors. The fifth one is something of a catch-all. It allows a board or commission to have a conversation about a document or documents that it believes are exempt from disclosure. It's a little broader than some of the other ones. So let's use an example. Anybody on a board that deals with bids or RFPs in any way? A couple of you do. There's an exemption in the FOIA Act. It's section 1-210B24. Isn't that neat that I know that? I can't remember my own name, but I remember that. So, but it says that you are allowed to withhold the content of bids or RFPs until you've actually signed a contract or concluded negotiations. So, the school board puts out bids for its transportation contract. Different bus companies all over the state bid on the bus contract. Well, the bids are exempt from disclosure. The board wants to look at the results of the bids. You can go into executive session, spread the bids out on the table and say, okay, this one's got this one's got too much for gas, this one too much mileage, those sort of things, and review them before they go out and make some kind of decision. Now that, just as an aside, that exemption is what's called a temporal exemption. Once the contract is signed, the exemption goes away and all that bid information comes out. But until a decision is made, those can be looked at. You ask your attorney for a written legal opinion. You, the board, are the client. So the document is covered by the attorney-client privilege. You wouldn't have to give it out. So you could go into executive session to talk about the written legal opinion that your attorney's given. There's just a couple of examples. Go back up just for a second to the personnel executive session. First of all, just saying executive session personnel or personnel matter is not enough. Courts have come down pretty hard on us on that and said, no, you've got to have more than just executive session personnel. Now, you don't necessarily have to name the individual you're going to talk about. So my recommendation is something like this. Executive session plan, discussion of a town hall employee, discussion of a public works employee, discussion of a school administrator, discussion of a school administrator, teacher, something like that. Just more than just personnel is required under the law. The other thing to remember about the personnel executive session is that the individual who's going to be discussed needs to be given notice in advance. A person needs to be told, we are going to talk about you in executive session tonight. I would recommend, by the way, at least 24 hours. It's not spelled out in here, but at least 24 hours, because that's the same amount of time that the agenda needs to be in. We're going to talk about you in executive session. And the person then has the right to come forward and say, no, you're not. I do not want that conversation to be held in executive session. I want it to be held in a public forum so that everybody can hear it. And if the person demands that and won't move off of that, you cannot go into executive session. The discussion must be held in public. Now, what sometimes happens is the board invites the individual in. The board invites the individual in and says, you want to come in, tell us your side of the story, talk to us about it. That's okay. But how many of you are employees? Remember that that's not required. So if you're ever going to be talked about in an executive session, they give you the option to discuss it in public, that's fine, but you do not have a right to demand to be in the executive session. You only get to go in if they invite you. So your right is to demand that public hearing, but not a right. And intuitively, that's one that always sort of got me, if they're going to talk about me, why don't I get to be in the room? But that's not what the law says. The law says that you have a right to be in the room in a public setting, but not in an executive session. The executive session for pending claims and pending litigation is pretty much what it sounds like. there's a lawsuit pending, there's a grievance, there's a claim of some kind, and you want to talk about your strategy, how you're going to deal with it. It's a little broader in that it lets a board or commission contemplate taking legal action. Do we have any ZBA folks in the room, by chance? No such luck. ZBA denies a variance to somebody, and the enforcement officer realizes, okay, they did it anyway. You know, we told them not to put that pool in, damn it, they put it in anyway. They're violating the zoning laws. So the ZBA wants to figure out a way to take action. You go into executive session to talk about it, they wouldn't have to sort of talk about their legal strategy in public that way. They're going to take action to protect the town's rights, to protect the ZBA's rights, so they can do that behind closed doors. That's the only situation in which, if there is no suit or serious threat of suit, you could do that. So a lot of people, land use is a prime example is, well, you know, if we approve this site plan, we might have a problem. Maybe you better talk about it before we vote. That's not good enough. Now, if there's a letter from a neighbor that says, if you approve this, I will sue you, I would say that is strong. But so there, you know, so there's a fine line there. But just your intuition, and even though the intuition might be correct, you can't necessarily just sort of say, I think we're going to get sued, so we better go talk about it. The last one would be the executive session for security reasons. And that one never used to come up with a real good example. But sadly, in the last few years, since Sandy Hook happened in 2012, I've had boards call, and I feel funny even using this as an example, but it's real, it's happened. Boards call and say, we want to talk about extra security at the school. We want to talk about maybe hiring an extra resource officer or new alarm systems or new locks or things like that. Can we do that in executive session? If you think about it, on the off chance that the wrong people are sitting in the audience that night, the people you're trying to keep out of the school, and they hear what you're going to do to try to protect the kids, that would kind of defeat the purpose. So there would be an example of a security executive session that you could have without the public present. Remember that in executive session, the only people who are technically guaranteed a right in there are the members of the board. Anybody else who comes in are on the invite of the board members, and only to give evidence, to give testimony, to use your expertise to help the board sort of deliberate, make a rational decision about something. Are there any questions about, yes? Yeah.
With that sort of situation, so the people on the board would have the rights at that point to ask people to leave and take other measures to have them leave if necessary?
Yeah, I mean, if it's an executive session and it's proper, people who are still in the room should leave. The board could use another room. I mean, you know, whatever it takes. But yes, once it's time, once the executive session is properly called, the room should be cleared. Was there another question? Yeah.
Tom, Ryan Wallace here, and I'm the chairman of the Conservation Commission, by the way. I got 4 out of 5 executive session reasons. I got personnel, legal matters, security, and bids for contracts.
Well, the bids would be for documents that are exempt. That's just an example. The bids are an example. So an exempt document, you could go in. The last one is a land transaction.
Land.
Right. If the town is going to be involved in buying or leasing a piece of property, you could negotiate behind closed doors. Okay. Yes?
Hi, I don't know if I missed it, I'm sorry, I was late, but did you
We'll let it
cover, did you cover if you can put executive session on an agenda and how you would put it and how you would document it on the minutes?
Well, a little bit in the executive session, because we said you put it on there if you know it's coming, and you want more than executive session personnel, you want more than executive session legal matter, you have to have more detail on there. In the minutes, there are no minutes of the executive session, in case that wasn't clear. The minutes are of the meeting, and the minutes reflect voted to go into executive session for reason number 1, whatever the reason is. Members, whoever it was, voted to go in, and then you come out. I would recommend putting the time on there. Executive session began at 7:10, ended at 7:30. Members came out and voted to do X, Y, and Z. That's how I would do that. Okay. Anything else on executive session? Okay, so I said there were 2 sort of avenues, paths that boards could use. The second one's kind of funky, I think. I read you the definition of a meeting, and the sentence that follows that definition goes like this. Meeting does not include. Meeting does not include. There follows a list of things, many of which everybody in this room would say is a meeting. The legislature said, that's swell, you can call them a meeting, but for the purposes of FOI, they're not a meeting. Which means they're not noticed, they're not open, and there are no minutes. Talk about confusing, right? Has anybody ever heard the term the non-meeting? That's kind of a term that's floated around the state from time to time. That makes me nuts, because it's a meeting that's not a meeting under FOI, but it's really, you know, so among those things that falls into that category, at the top of the list is collective bargaining. We have unions in Plainfield. Collective bargaining sessions, strategy sessions, negotiating sessions are not meetings. And has anybody ever done those? Isn't it as much fun as you've ever had in your life, right? You sit at a table, right? Sit at a table and you make an offer. They laugh hysterically, and they counter, and then you laugh hysterically. Then you start fighting and arguing, and you're there all night sometimes. You are there all night, and I don't know about your situation, but in our town, you know, the things that we're negotiating, those kind of contracts, that takes a huge chunk of our budget. That's a pretty big deal, yet the law says that nobody knows about it. It's not a notice meeting, it's not open. So, you know, you sit there for hours, you're doing a really important task, but it's not a meeting. By the way, if you've ever done, you know, one of those long collective bargaining sessions, it's probably not a good idea to do what I did, is to go home and tell your wife you've been in a 4-hour non-meeting. It doesn't necessarily fly, you know, but you get the idea, a non-meeting. Another thing that's not a meeting, executive level search committees. You know, you've got an important position, a school board, your superintendent is retiring. You're gonna put together get a new superintendent. You put together a committee to look for that new superintendent. You can do that outside of freedom of information. Now, that one makes a little sense. You're gonna be looking for top flight candidates, and you'll probably get candidates who are people with jobs already. And they probably don't want their current employers to know that they're looking. That one kind of makes sense. You operate outside, you pick a candidate, and bring the candidate forward. Chance meetings, social gatherings. You all love each other. You all want to go to Gus's, or what was the other one you said? Dr. Z's, or Mr. Z's for dinner, and you want to have dinner. Well, of course you can do that, but the wording I find humorous. It says, you can have a social or chance meeting if it's neither planned nor intended for the purpose of discussing matters relating to official business. I ask you, what else are you going to talk about when you go out to dinner? Let us not be naive or unrealistic. The conversations are going to take place. They shouldn't take place at all, but they're going to. My strongest recommendation on that front is to recognize that they're going to happen, but keep them very simple. What did I miss at the last meeting? What do we want on the agenda next time? Do not have those deep, deliberative conversations at dinner that you should be having at the table. I guarantee you the one time that you do, the wrong person is sitting in the next booth and files a complaint with the FOI Commission. I heard them discussing their budget and arguing about budget issues. First of all, it's a recipe for disaster. Second of all, the idea is to do your work in public. Now again, let's not be naive. Where do the best meetings in Plainfield take place? In that parking lot, right? Am I right? After the meeting, business. The board that I was chairman of, right? The chairman usually is kind of one of the last ones to leave. Turn off the lights and answer a few questions from people. I'd walk out in that parking lot and have little clusters of board members having discussions. I'd say, what are you doing? You can't do that. You can't do that. Now, again, conversations are going to take place, but understand that if they get too deep, you're vulnerable to a complaint. And you're also violating the spirit of the law, which is to do your work in public. So be real careful the extent to which you have those discussions outside of the arena. You know, I always say, don't set the budget over the eggnog at the Christmas party. Be really careful how you do that. There's one other one that I should bring up, and you can look at them. There's a second definition in the law. Do you utilize the caucus at all? Caucus is sort of a giant loophole in the law. We think it's one of those things that the legislature's put in there to get that unanimous vote back in 1975. It allows members of the same board and the same party to do all the things I've been telling you not to do. Same board, same party. Where people get in big trouble with that is, oh, let's have the town clerk come in, or let's have the Board of Ed have a caucus and bring the Board of Finance chairman or something like that. Once you break that same board, same party, it's not a caucus anymore, it's a meeting, and you've got yourselves a problem. I took a call from a fairly well-known attorney this morning. It just shows you that people just don't get it. He says, I'm calling you because they made me. I said, what was that? She said, the Board of Ed and the Board of Finance, and I think it was West Hartford. The Board of Ed and the Board of Finance wanted caucus, I don't even know which party, the Dems and the Rs want to caucus together. I told them they can't do that. They made me call you to check. I said, that's right, because the two boards can't caucus together. BOE could, or the BOF separately, but same board, same party. Don't get hung up on that. Yes?
So if you had a majority of unaffiliated voters on a board, would that rule still apply?
Yes.
Or does it have to be
No,
a
the
registered party?
unaffiliated still caucus amongst themselves.
Okay.
Right. And if one of them doesn't like that, there's a provision that allows them to jump to one of the parties. They'd have to put it in writing, give it, well, Louisa left, give it to the town clerk. And then once you do that, you're locked in. So in other words, you can't jump back and forth. You would then be locked in for that process. It's not something that we encourage. It is a giant loophole, but it doesn't get used as often as you would think. It's best not to use it if you can. You got to do your work in public. Now, the other thing we should talk about with meetings before we talk a little bit about, well, two other things. First of all, when I read you the definition, I don't know if you caught the words. It said whether in person or by means of electronic equipment. Electronic equipment was written, 43 years ago, where that powerful chairman gets on the phone and says, I need your vote on this and your vote on that. You're going to do this, you're going to do that, bing, bang, boom. You walk into a packed house, all in favor, and what happened? Where's the debate? Where's the discussion? Well, they did it on the phone before the meeting took place, and you can't do that. You cannot do that. In 2018, soon to be 19, we're talking about a lot more than telephones. The texting, the emailing, the blogging, the Twitter, the Facebook. I don't tell people not to use those devices, not to use those vehicles. Don't have the conversations via those vehicles that we should be having here at the table. I get calls all the time from people who say, can I send out something to my board, which I sort of give them information about, or I got a request. This one came today from Groton, and they voted to buy a new van. And one of the organizations in town wanted to buy the old one. So the first selectman sends out an email to everybody that says, we've ordered the new van, and I don't know, Commission on Aging wants to buy the old one. That's fine. That's fine. Put it on the agenda next time and talk about it. But what happened is a couple of council members jumped in and said, why do we want to do that? And once they start that conversation, you're basically having a meeting. He shut it down, but that's where you have to be cognizant of the fact that you can't communicate via those people. And let's face it, we are not as artful via email, via text, as we might be where we're sitting at a table in a public meeting. And so we've got a double jeopardy there, because someone can say, I want to see any and all emails between the first selectman and other selectmen. And if you've been doing a lot of that, first of all, it's, oh, they really think that? They really feel that? And, oh, by the way, they had a pretty serious conversation that turned into a meeting, and so you're sort of cooked on two fronts. So to the extent that you use those devices, disseminate information, talk about what's going to be on the agenda, that's all fair game. But don't have the conversations, again, just like the parking lot, just like the restaurant, do your work in public. Do your work in public. Yes?
And also, if a member has their cell phone out at the table during the meeting and they're texting or whatever, a lot of boards and commissions don't get or don't accept, and correct me if I'm wrong, that phone then is FOIAble.
If it has to do with board business, it sure does.
Yeah.
Now, strong recommendation. Put the damn phones away at the meeting.
Right.
That's the easiest way to, I have had situations where people are seeing texting and what were they texting about? Who were they texting to? Were they, and are they having a meeting within a meeting? Are they making fun of somebody in the audience? It's just, the best thing to do is to put the phones away. The board that I had, God bless her, there was one woman who would not put the damn phone away. I could not get her to put her phone down. She insisted she needed to have it out so that she could keep tabs on her kids. Maybe she was a helicopter mom, I don't know. But the bottom line is, if somebody wanted to see that stuff, she'd have to somehow show that it was her kids and that she wasn't texting with, somebody in the audience or something else and discussing board business that she shouldn't be doing. So the best advice is to put the phone away during the meeting, or at least, have it on the table and just check it for time or whatever you're gonna do. Because that's a true recipe for another problem that you just don't need. The last thing we should talk about with meetings, before we talk a little bit about public records, are the minutes. Do we have any minutes preparers in the room? 1, 2. I feel your pain. I do the FOI commission meeting minutes. Here's my advice on minutes. They need not be the recreation of War and Peace. They are not every word that everybody says. Some people want them to be, some people think they should be, but minutes are not verbatim transcripts of the meeting. In fact, the only technical legal requirement for minutes is a record of who votes for what or for whom. Now, you want more than that. You're creating Plainfield's historical record, but how much more is entirely your decision, not the person in the audience who's screaming at the board, or a board member, you don't have any like this, who happen to be a little verbose. You have none of things. But here's the problem. When you start doing those big, long blah, blah, blahs in the minutes, oh, I didn't say that. I didn't mean that. We got to take that out. I sound stupid. Stuff like that. You don't want that. A crisp, clear, concise recapitulation of what happens is the very best way to go, and that's what you should do with your minutes. Yes?
Getting back to that, if there is someone who is extremely detailed, and they do put down what so-and-so said correctly because they got it from the tape, and then so-and-so says at the meeting next month when they're approving the minutes, well, you know what I intended was this, so we need to change the minutes.
And there's the problem. Now remember, there's still
So
your
then
minutes.
the minutes wouldn't be changed.
Right. Now, if the board chooses to, there's not much you can do about it. I wouldn't change them, especially if you're confident that the person has done them correctly. Here's an email I got from the chairman of the Waterford East Lyme Shellfish Commission after I did a workshop down there a little earlier this year. There's a question about minutes. And there's a guy who got up and spoke, and they have a lot of what he said, and then they've got in here, he requested a copy, his name is Fred Wise, he requested a copy of the 15-month study noted in the DEEP public hearing notice that was sent out to area homeowners. Stated the areas of Keeney Cove and Golden Spur waters are polluted. It is against granting a project for an NBSF when NBSF already has one in East Lyme's Niantic Bay. So the minutes go out, and then old Fred Wise sends them a nice long note. It says, well, I didn't really say that, I didn't mean that, I did not state this, and that's wrong, blah, blah, blah. So he writes back and he says, I know minutes are not verbatim. How would you suggest we handle this going forward? Should we be more general in how we report public comment? E.g., Mr. Weiss commented on the NBSF aquaculture project. Yes, that says it all, does it not? He's acknowledged, that's what he was talking about, end of story. Think in terms of crisp, clear, concise, not a verbatim transcript. Remember that the minutes need to be available in 7 days, and you put the minutes out there, and then you're done, and you move on to the next meeting. If you are going to change them, if there are corrections or things that need to be made, they are made at the next meeting, and that meeting's minutes reflect the changes in the previous minutes. Okay. Yes?
Say someone missed the meeting and we have generic, or less detailed minutes, and then I approach the chairman somewhere outside of a meeting to receive the actual details, is that allowed?
See, I would argue that that's okay. I would argue that, let's not get crazy about that. I missed the meeting, the minutes don't tell me more, can you fill me in? I would say that's fine. I would argue that that's fine. Now, if you start arguing with the chairman about what they did, that's a different story. But just getting information, I would argue is okay.
On the minutes,
Yeah.
matter of public record, before they're approved?
Yes, yes. A lot of people get hung up on that. They say we haven't approved them yet, but the law says 7 days. So if you don't meet within 7 days, they still have to go out. Yes?
Can you just mention to them about the acts?
The who?
The 48 hours to get the acts in if they don't get the minutes done.
There needs to be a record of votes available in 48 hours. It need not be a formal document necessarily. It needs to be available, so if you're, you said conservation, maybe the land use office, there's a list of how you guys voted, so that if somebody wants to know, they can find out. Some sort of a written record of that. It doesn't necessarily become a permanent record. Some towns like it to be a permanent record, but doesn't have to be. Anything else on meetings? I'll give you a little bit about the public records if you'd like. Yes?
I just want.
Who invited her, right?
You to
I'm just kidding, we're friends, we're friends.
We are. I just wanted you to clarify some things to everybody. So the tapes are, retention record says the tapes of minutes only have to be kept for 6 months.
Okay.
Some people feel like the tapes are the permanent record. Could you
Okay,
just mention that?
if you record a meeting, it's not required under FOI. Record a meeting, it becomes a public record. Retention schedule is entirely separate from FOI. You still need to create those written minutes. The recordings, whatever the retention schedule says, and I don't pretend to know it, it's a whole different department, a whole different set of rules. That's what you go by.
But the written minutes are the minutes.
Written minutes are minutes, and they are permanent.
Thank you.
That's it? For now, right? Okay.